Hello, everyone. This is part one of lesson one of Presocratic to Augustine, the class that we also call History of Philosophy 1. Now, our first question is, what is Presocratic philosophy? And that may sound like it is a terminological question, but it really isn't. It is a philosophical question. In the last 10 or 20 years, people have stopped to use the label Presocratic philosophy. And instead, now we, people who specialize in ancient philosophy, we say instead early Greek philosophy. And a lot of thought and discussion has gone into that terminological choice. And I want to tell you a little bit about this because that gives us an introduction to the first couple of classes of the semester. So in the olden days, when we spoke about pre-Socratic philosophy, the thought was just, well, that is a term, like a notion that is temporal. And really what it says is we are talking about those philosophers that are prior to Socrates, pre-Socratic. And as far as it goes, that's okay, even though some of the later pre-Socratics are almost contemporaneous with Socrates. So it's not like super correct, but it's good enough. But this temporal chronological argument is not the main thing here. The main idea is that in these traditional editions on pre-Socratic philosophy, in the volumes, books that were written about it, there was huge focus on a certain type of thinker. And that type of thinker were people who were asking how to understand nature, how to understand the universe, how to understand the cosmos. And to some extent, even beyond that, how to understand reality at large, where that may include the cosmos, but may go beyond visible, physical, perceptible reality. So there was this presumption that that is what philosophy is. Philosophy is the kind of field which asks, what is nature? What is the universe? How can we understand the physical cosmos? And meanwhile, it seems that scholars neglected another kind of early Greek thinker, namely people who are called Sophists. And scholars kind of just went along with the idea that to be a sophist is a bad thing. And that is something that you can sort of pick up in some Platonic dialogues, but only according to a certain reading of these dialogues. And you can also think, well, that is not quite what Plato is saying. Rather, he is saying that the sophists are somehow dangerous because they are incredibly good rhetoricians. They are extremely good at oratory, and oratory merely persuades rather than seeking the truth. But at the same time, Plato strongly and persistently engages with sophists and very much makes them his interlocutors. And he wouldn't really be doing that if he didn't think that they are philosophers. And the more scholars thought about some of these sophists, in particular, for example, Protagoras, who might be the most famous sophist, they recognized that really what these sophists were doing is also philosophy. It's just not the same kind of philosophy. It's not about what is nature. Rather, it is maybe what today we would call ethics, philosophy of law, maybe philosophy of like the political domain. So there has been a shift in recent years saying, well, those philosophers who were called sophists should really be recognized as important philosophers because they contribute something to the field that today we call ethics. And what they contribute is that they are kind of traveling intellectuals. They go from city to city. They don't live in Athens. The sophists are, in some sense, traveling intellectuals who don't have a steady job. They are educators. They offer their services to teach the young in different cities. And what they promise is that when they teach you, they make you successful. Well, what is it that they make you successful in? They make you successful in winning the argument, in making speeches that are going to persuade other people. That was perceived as somehow possibly dangerous because, who are these people? Maybe they're going to persuade me of something that I don't want to be persuaded of. But at the same time, it was tempting because if you have to decide, where you send your kids to school and you think, well, I want them to be successful in life, then maybe you will say, well, I send them to the sophists. So that was kind of the dynamic. And that is also what gives the sophists, to some extent, a bad name. But at the same time, they were raising a very deep philosophical question, and the question that later comes to be called the question of relativism, namely whether it is possible that different ways to live are good and right for different people. That's a very deep question, a very complicated question. And when we turn to Plato and Aristotle later in the semester, we will return to that question, where Plato and Aristotle kind of respond to Protagoras, who says in a famous formulation that human beings are the measure. And both Plato and Aristotle think that something about that is right, because how we should live is going to be somehow about human beings. But they don't want it to be relativism. So that is a major contribution to philosophy. And because it is a major contribution, nowadays we think that early Greek philosophy is kind of broader category. It is not only natural philosophy or philosophy of like what is the world, what is reality, but it is also those kinds of beginnings of ethics. And for that reason, we are kind of no longer calling our class Presocratic to Augustine, even though that label is still somehow in the books. We are now saying History of Philosophy 1, because in some sense, we sort of want to recognize this new insight in scholarship that the earliest Greek thinkers are this small, diverse group of people consisting not just of natural philosophers, but also of the Sophists. That said, we are starting our class with one of those so-called natural philosophers, namely Thales. And that is what the next section of my video recordings is going to be about.